A few months ago, I made a video on penetration and how bad it actually is. However, we are now getting closer to the version 1.4, things changed a little bit, and we also got Yanagi, which gets penetration on her kit, which sparked some questions about stacking penetration once again. You might also have noticed that I started to recommend penetration on some of my latest guides, so yeah, penetration isn't as bad as it used to be, right? Okay, so this time we're not going too deep into the formula and numbers, and instead I'll try to explain it without using too much math and formulas. Basically, penetration is a stat that tells you how much defense from the enemy you are able to ignore when dealing damage to them. It is a stat that the more you stack it, the better it becomes. So players are often confused with the actual DPS increase you can get from penetration when compared to damage. Defense threat is similar to penetration, however, it is multiplicative with penetration, so it's not the wisest idea to stack both of them. Defense threat is also a debuff on the enemy, unlike penetration, which is an offensive stat. This has some implications, especially for anomaly damage, since your stats is snapshotted when building up anomalies on the enemy. The final enemy defense gives you something called defense multiplier, which reduces your final damage by a certain amount based on your level and the enemy defense. Since the enemy defense cannot go below 0, this means that the maximum value for this defense multiplier is 1, and once you reach this point, stacking penetration becomes pointless. And before you think removing the enemy defense should be your top priority, it isn't as simple as it seems. That's because 24% penetration on disc 5 is not going to translate to 24% DPS increase, while 30% damage can become a final 30% DPS increase. But that's only if you have 0 damage sources, and this isn't something that is going to happen that often, so... Now, this is something that I barely explained in my previous video, and I'm sorry because it's a really important point and something you'll listen to quite a lot. I'm going to give an example without numbers so everyone can understand how it works. Imagine you have 2 cups of water, and one is completely empty and the second one has some water on it. Now add some drops of water and you're going to barely notice the difference on the second cup. However, the first one, it was dry before, but there's a little bit of water here, so it's way easier for you to see the difference. And that's the exact same thing that happens with stats. Once you start to get a lot of a specific stat, adding more to it has less impact than before. This happens with almost every single stat in the game, and penetration might be the only exception here. So for example, it is not a great idea to run 3 attack discs because you're saturating attack to the point where each disc is going to give you less DPS increase than the previous one. You also need to consider combat stats. For example, if you're running Caesar, she's going to give you a total of 1000 attack, and that's one of the reasons why you're not going to see a lot of attack discs being used on slot 5, because there's a lot of attack buffs available in the game. Another reason is the fact that both penetration and damage can get attack as a substat, but the other way around is not possible. So for example, let's include the Yanagi's health buffs, 10% penetration, 30% damage bonuses, and Chaos Jazz for another 50% damage. And there you go. You can notice something different here. Damage is still better than penetration, but 30% damage is not 30% DPS increase anymore. Now, just to illustrate how crazy things can get, let's increase Yanagi's damage to 100% and then repeat the same test. There you go. Penetration is now better than damage on slot 5, and even though it's a 1% DPS difference only, we're not using Rina here. So imagine how good it becomes once you add more penetration sources on top of it. I could end the video on the previous chapter, but I think it's quite important to explain why penetration is now something good. It is not because enemies got stronger or we're getting new ways to stack penetration. It's because we're getting a lot of new damage sources. It has always been about what you're sacrificing to get that extra penetration. The only universal sources of penetration are Disc 5, Perfect Electro, and Rina. And all of these options means you need to give up on something else just to get a bit of penetration. Disc 5 means you're removing 30% damage from your build, Perfect Electro removes another 2-piece set, which could be a damage set or even another proficiency, and Rina takes a slot on your team, which could be better used for another unit. Now, things are a little bit different. We have Protopunk, which can add a consistent 15% damage for your team, Chaos Jazz, shield defense buffs, Caesar with her signature. A lot of new options are being added, and to be honest, I know that my example on Grace on the very first video was a bit of extreme, because she has 0 damage on her kit, and this is not the reality of most DPS units. For attackers, they usually get a lot of damage on specific skills, so sometimes going for damage is still completely fine. Take a look at G1 for example. Even with all the damage she gets on shot shells, Caesar and Nicole on the team, the difference between a penetration disc and a damage disc isn't that huge. So to finish it up and answer the question between penetration versus damage, both are fine. And since we're getting a lot of damage sources in the game, penetration isn't as underwhelming as it used to be. But to be honest, electric and anomaly units are the one who can benefit the most from penetration stacking. That's mostly because Rina is the only source of penetration outside of disc sets in disc 5, and also because we don't have a penetration weapon for attackers. And I don't think we're going to see penetration engines for attackers, but even so, crit engines will probably beat penetration engines for a crit-based character. If you want a more specific breakpoint, if you can hit 90% damage without a disc 5, then you're free to use penetration if your substats are better in the penetration disc. This isn't a rule, and of course for units who can stack penetration, things can go a little bit different, and you might not even need 90% damage before swapping to penetration. But even so, it's around 1% DPS difference, so not everyone's going to min-max their damage to that point. At the end of the day, it's all about the substats. You need to get good substats, otherwise just going for the main stats not going to help you that much. Some players also find penetration to be universal, which is true. But I personally don't like swapping discs between my units because I always forget to swap back once again. Because of this, I would rather play with suboptimal disc than use a perfect disc. But that's personal preference, and if you don't mind it, going for a good perfect electric disc and a great penetration disc can be your best choice. Anyway, I hope this clears up some information on my previous video, and if you're interested in some extra math and formulas, then I highly recommend checking out my other video. Remember to give it a like, and if you still have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments down below or join my Discord server. As usual, thanks for watching, have a beautiful day, and I'll see you in my next video.